Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rabbi Eli Friedman from Congregation Rodeph Shalom. It's good to be with all of you this evening. I want to begin just with a quick note before that this is not our topic tonight, but I feel it's important to just lift up as we begin the news of today and the verdict being delivered in the Derek Chauvin trial, and that there is a relief across our nation that we share tonight. And in our Jewish tradition, we mark this by saying the words from our Torah, Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. Congregation Rodeph Shalom is pleased to present this program tonight in partnership with the Feinstein Center and the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Stockton University. Before we introduce our speakers, I want to offer a brief framing. This program was designed to present a few perspectives on how we define anti-Semitism and the possibilities and dangers of giving those definitions legal or state-sanctioned force. We are eager to present this program first because incidences of anti-Semitic violence have been on the rise, and second, because while there is broad agreement that some acts or words are clearly anti-Semitic, in the realm of speech and actions, especially when it comes to Israel-Palestine, there is substantive disagreement. These disagreements have appeared in striking fashion on university campuses, where efforts to define what is or is not anti-Semitism have been the source of conflict and have sparked debates about academic freedom. Tonight, we have asked two speakers who come from different backgrounds and institutional locations to offer their perspectives on the complex challenge of defining anti-Semitism. I want to underline the fact that these two speakers with different viewpoints, and they do not speak on behalf of any of the institutions represented here. And in the future, we will continue to explore these questions in other formats and with other speakers who bring other perspectives. Lastly, I want to lift up that Congregation Rodeph Shalom and the Union of Reformed Judaism, for which we are members, believe in Israel's right to exist and the Palestinian people's right to statehood. We also work on a regular basis to combat anti-Semitism in our community and beyond through dialogue and education. The goal of this program tonight is to inform broad and significant public conversations with evidence, analysis, and a diversity of perspectives. We can think of few other ways to advance our understanding of our world, and we are happy you are joining us in this work. I now turn it over to Roz Siegel to introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Eli Friedman. Good evening, everyone. My name is Roz Siegel. I'm the director of the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Stockton University. I'm one of the organizers of tonight's discussion on the weaponization of the discourse around anti-Semitism, together with Rabbi Eli Friedman at Congregation Rodeph Shalom, and Dr. Ariel Verdin and Dr. Laila Corwin-Berman at the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History at Temple University. We started planning this event more than a year ago. It was originally scheduled to take place in person in October 2020. We decided to postpone to April 2021, with the hope of holding it in person. When we realized that we would not be able to do so, we decided to move forward with a webinar event, since we all agreed that this discussion is urgently needed. Indeed, over the past few years, anti-Jewish incidents of all kinds around the world, including violence, have increased and intensified. At the same time, we are witnessing troubling ways in which discussions around Israel and the struggle of Palestinians under Israeli occupation have occurred, or in some cases been silenced through accusations of anti-Semitism, especially on university campuses. It is therefore a great privilege and a great honor that Joyce Ajlouny and Kenneth Stern have agreed to join us to address definitions of anti-Semitism and their uses in the context of these dangerous processes and how to discuss them on university campuses. Joyce Ajlouny joined the American Friends Service Committee as General Secretary in 2017. The American Friends Service Committee is a global peace and justice Quaker organization founded 104 years ago and works in 16 countries and nearly 30 US localities to challenge unjust systems of oppression and promote lasting peace. A Quaker leader who is committed to help bring peace and justice to oppressed and vulnerable communities globally, Joyce Ajlouny brings to the American Friends Service Committee a depth of experience in international development, education, and 27 years of nonprofit management. Under her leadership, the American Friends Service Committee is entering its second century with a bold strategic revisioning and planning initiative that will set organizational goals for the next decade until 2030. Palestinian American, Joyce Ajlouny started her career working in international development in Palestine, focusing on minority and refugee rights, gender equality, economic development, and humanitarian support. She served as a country director for Palestine and Israel with Oxfam, Great Britain, chaired the Association of International Development Agencies there, and worked as the program manager at various UN agencies. Prior to joining the American Friends Service Committee, Joyce served as the director of the Ramallah Friends School in Palestine for 13 years, where she led a diverse staff to transform the school academically, physically, and financially. Kenneth Stern is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate and an attorney and award-winning author. For 25 years, he was the American Jewish Committee's expert on anti-Semitism, and he was also the lead drafter of the working definition of anti-Semitism. He has argued before the Supreme Court of the United States and testified before Congress. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and the Forward. He has been a visiting assistant professor of Jewish studies and a visiting assistant professor of human rights at Bard College. As a trial attorney before his AJC tenure, Stern was involved in several high visibility cases, among them his defense of American Indian Movement co-founder Dennis Banks in one of the last post-Wounded Knee cases. Stern's book about this case, Law ad Hoc, the United States versus the American Indian Movement, won the prestigious Gustavus Myers Award. Stern's book about the Oklahoma City bombing, A Force Upon the Plain, the American Militia Movement and the Politics of Hate, was nominated for the National Book Award. Stern has also written books on anti-Semitism and on Holocaust denial. His most recent book is The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestinian Campus Debate. The discussion tonight will be moderated by Dr. Lila Corwin-Behrman, who is a professor of history and the director of the Feinstein Center at Temple University. This year, she has been on sabbatical as a fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. Lila, please.
Hello, welcome everyone. And I think our panelists can unmute and put their videos on because we're now all in this conversation together. So let's just wait for a minute for that to happen.
Hi, Lila.
Hi, Ken. It's wonderful to be here. And Joyce, let's see, there you are. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Nice to be with you.
And welcome everybody. It's, you know, how our world works right now, that we are not able to see one another. And yet I hope that in this conversation that is going to be wide ranging and will show that people have different perspectives and different viewpoints, that we can also see the human in one another. Certainly the panelists, but beyond, with all the folks who are here tonight to be part of this program. I'm so grateful. So let's dive into this. There's a lot to talk about. I think it's fair to say, I'm certain it's fair to say that we can agree that anti-Semitism, like other forms of group hatred, it's anathema and it should not be tolerated. So certainly we can agree on that. However, the question tonight is how we define anti-Semitism and what we do with that definition. So I want to start by asking each of you to reflect, and again, knowing that you're reflecting from your experiences, from your institutional locations, from the knowledge and the kind of specific data and analysis you have. I want you each to think about the question of whether it's valuable to define anti-Semitism, and if so, what's a productive way of doing so? So Ken, do you want to start us off, and then we'll hear from you, Joyce?
Sure. And to me, the fundamental question really is less about definitions in some ways and more about how do you understand anti-Semitism, what do you do about it? As was noted in the introduction, I'm the director of a Center for the Study of Hate, and I see anti-Semitism as a subset of this long-time human capacity to define and demonize and sometimes dehumanize an other. So it's in that context that I look about how do we understand anti-Semitism, what do we do about it? Definitions are useful, but only to a particular extent. And this particular working definition, which is now known as the IRA definition, really came about because when there was a collapse of the peace process in the early 2000s, and there were an uptick in attacks on Jews, particularly in Western Europe, but elsewhere as well, there was a group called the EUMC that was tasked, European Monitoring Center on Xenophobia and Racism, that was tasked doing a report, and it found that it had a problem. The data collectors in different parts of Europe had no common set of references to what to include or exclude in the report. So part of the exercise, which I can talk about how it came about in more detail, but part of the exercise was to give some data collectors the ability to look at anti-Semitism for reports across borders, across time. It was never to label anybody an anti-Semite. It was never put together as a tool for a witch hunt, basically to say, aha, you said something outside of the scope. It was for a much larger purpose to basically take a feel of the climate rather than to label anybody. You're muted, Lila. Welcome to Zoom.
Ugh, a year and how many months into this, I make that error. Okay, well, so with that kind of background, and obviously, you know, Ken, you will illuminate us more in this discussion more with your experience, you know, as part of a team of folks working on that kind of working definition. But Joyce, turning to you, and again to this question of, you know, what kind of value is there in defining anti-Semitism? What are productive ways to think about doing so? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Sure, Lila. Hi, everybody. Good to be with you. Yeah, I think definitions are important. If you know, any form of discrimination needs to be defined and understood. Defining and understanding discrimination helps as we work to challenge and end discrimination and the systems that support it. So, you know, that said, there has been a very concerted effort over the last 2 decades to politicize the definition of anti-Semitism, and that's destructive, you know. And so for me, what, you know, I found value, AFSC, for example, the organization that I lead, defines anti-Semitism as discrimination against, violence towards, or stereotypes of Jews for being Jewish. Is an insidious form of bigotry that has been used to justify oppression and violence throughout centuries. It is wrong, and it's disturbing to see it prevalent today. So, you know, I appreciate the simplicity of this, but, you know, the definitions, you know, for all of our isms, I think it should be interchangeable, recognizing, of course, that contexts are different, but, you know, bigotry is bigotry, and anti-Black and anti-Asian and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and homophobia, they're all intertwined, and our struggles are connected, and then our strategies for liberation and dignity and safety are interconnected. So we really can't dismantle one from the other. So our definitions need to be sort of close in language. And this is sort of what I found blatantly missing from the IHRA definition, because it makes no reference to universal principles of bigotry, of discrimination. This is the one thing about the new Alternative Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, the JDA. I found that that's refreshing, in that they do refer to the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights, and they remind us, rightly so, that anti-Semitism is an instance of racism and not a unique evil. So I can talk about, perhaps very quickly, two non-productive ways of defining Semitism. One is politicizing its definition, which makes it more difficult to actually address real anti-Semitism. I'm reminded of the boy who cried wolf, a situation where constant accusations of anti-Semitism against Palestinians and those who support Palestinian rights for their political positions means that those who actually are anti-Semitic can point to the false accusations to excuse their own actions. And so that to me is a non-productive way. Another one is the conflation of anti-Semitic speech and the legitimate criticism of Israel or Zionism, and this causes confusion. And I'll say more about it as we move along in our discussion today.
Thank you for both of those perspectives. So one of the things, you're both pointing to language that can be used certainly to define anti-Semitism, right? Joyce, you're pointing especially to an approach that contextualizes it and puts it within the framework of other forms of hatred. And Ken, my understanding is in part that you were thinking about a kind of practical tools for forms of data collection. But the question I want to move us toward a little bit, and one of the reasons that definitions in certain ways become more than just academic discussions, is sometimes they're used for law and policy. So I want you to help us understand, again, from where each of you sits, what value, or is there value, in trying to think about ways that laws can be framed around particular definitions of anti-Semitism? Or should we think, in fact, we know that there's really no precisely legal definition of racism, for instance, in this country, right? And there's lots of discussion about why that is the case. So I'd love to hear you reflect on what it means for a definition to enter into law and policy.
Sure, and just to broaden up the discussion a little bit more, I mean, Joyce had mentioned the JDA alternative definition of anti-Semitism. There are actually a couple others, the Nexus one, and there's an Independent Jewish Voice one. The core of all of them, which I think is the right thing, at least the way I think about anti-Semitism, is it's 2 points. Anti-Semitism is conspiracy theory about Jews trying to harm non-Jews, and it provides an explanation for what goes wrong in the world, from Jews killing Jesus to poisoning wells to starting forest fires in California with space lasers. That's the common thing. The rest is sort of commentary for other purposes. And the problem when you start trying to put it in law in a way to infringe speech is precisely the point that Lila was making. Imagine if we were talking, instead of anti-Semitism, talking about racism. And you wanted a definition with specific examples that would help disguise, for taking the temperature, which is really the major thing. Would you include opposition to affirmative action? Would you include somebody who says that what happened in the verdict today in Minneapolis, that was justice wrong, he should have been acquitted? Would you include things like that? Well, you wouldn't want the government to adopt things that prioritize certain speech over other types of speech. There's a basic First Amendment principle, and in the academy, and we can talk about this more, there's a basically academic freedom principle. So we want people to be able to have differences of opinion and not have the government weigh down on one side or another. That said, I wanted to point out a couple of other things that I thought were important about the IRA definition that aren't in the other ones. Again, not, it's to guide policy, but not again to HR things on campus or whatever. There was a question, part of the reason why the definition was put together the way that it was that there was a question initially from the EUMC about what do you do if a Jew is beaten up as a stand-in for an Israeli? And it had a sort of a working type of a definition before the one that I helped create that looked at anti-Semitism as a series of stereotypes. And it basically said, if a person had these ideas about a Jew and transferred them to Israelis, and then that got retransferred back to beating up somebody, it was in London or Paris or whatever, that was lamentable but not anti-Semitism. And to me, that was nuts. It was, as I've said many times, it's the same as saying if somebody is attacking a black person because you have stereotypes about blacks, that's racism and should be counted, but not if they're upset at some policy, Civil Rights Act or something. So that was one of the real pushes for getting the working definition, which is to get people to think about hate crimes. You're selecting somebody based on who they are or who they're associated with. Not do you have to psychoanalyze, do they really hate Jews? And so I think that for a guiding principle is important. And I do hope that we see more countries adopt that in terms of policy for all groups about not trying to psychoanalyze, do they really hate? But when you try to institutionalize it in law, it becomes very problematic. And part of where I started seeing the abuse of the definition, there were examples about Israel, because again, it was to take the temperature, and we saw an association between attacks on Israel in the press and attacks on Jews, not to say causation, but there was a correlation. We started seeing what are called Title VI cases in the United States, where there's a law that prohibits harassment, intimidation, discrimination in higher education that's pervasive. And we started seeing groups on the Jewish right saying, aha, let's say that a person is teaching something, a person is bringing in speakers, this discourse on a campus that they said was violative of the definition, and they were trying to use that as a way to to create a Title VI case, and all those cases lost. And then what happened was they tried to push it for the University of California, and that lost, and they went to Congress. And one thing that's really interesting is when the law to try to take the definition and require the Department of Education to look at the definition in these cases, it passed unanimously in the Senate. Because who could be against anti-Semitism, right? Bernie Sanders assented to it. But when you look at the text and look about what it means to institutionalize it into law, that's where it hit the roadblock. And it was not only progressives, it was libertarians and some others that realized the free speech implications. And when Trump signed it into an executive order, that to me was a real problem. To say that you have to look at this particular definition of anti-Semitism. And Kushner said when it was announced, our policy is anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Well, some anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitism, but not all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. To establish that as a principle of law, to me, is abhorrent.
Thank you, and thank you for providing that kind of historical viewpoint, chronological viewpoint. I do just have one question of clarification.
Sure.
In terms then of the standing of the executive order, and so if there is a Title VI case, does that executive order have particular standing in terms of how that case would be understood, or what is the role right now of the executive order?
Do you want me to answer it? Or okay. Well, 2 points. One is that it's still on the books. I think it'll probably still stay on the books. I think it's become sort of the holy grail, and politically it would be difficult to take it out. But I'm less concerned about the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 cases where this is going to have an impact. I'm more concerned about the administrators who know that their job is to protect universities from being sued, and that means that they feel an obligation to interrupt or to stop or to complain about speech that is potentially violative of the definition, because they know that there are groups out there poised to sue. So I'm much more worried about the chilling effect than the legal implications in any particular case.
Thanks for that clarification. And Joyce, when you think about the movement, you read a definition that your organization has in terms of thinking about anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. What is your understanding of what the relationship between that and law should be? How do you think about that question?
Well, I think, Ken, you covered it well. But from where I sit, I think when a definition that was created for data analysis and for research, to me that these definitions are can shift depending on the research. Research is inquiry based, and so I feel like they're malleable in some way. But when you take that research definition and place it in a legal context, you lose the flexibility and contextualization, and the interpretation of the definition is no longer up to the researcher, but basically rests with legal authorities, and who can only go by the text before them. So it becomes very rigid, and it's very dangerous when that happens. And so and we've seen so many examples of that. Even on a similar note, we saw an example of how legislation, because that's in a way linked on the BDS front, how and there are many examples, but the one that comes to mind is Bahia Awana, I believe her name is the teacher from Texas, who's a speech pathologist, who was asked to sign a contract with a stipulation that asks her to not boycott Israel or while she's working for the school district, and when she refused, she lost her job. Which means, like, if she thinks that if she makes a decision that she wants to go and buy or not buy, I should say, boycott Sabra hummus because she believes this company aids the occupation of her people in Israel, in Palestine, then she can lose her job. I mean, that's the absurdity of how when these definitions and start coming in to law and contracts and whatnot, they become quite absurd and dangerous and problematic.
So I'm curious, it seems that you've all pointed to reasons that it would be prudent not to accept one kind of definition, to use it maybe as an interpretive guide to think about context. But we do see, and Ken, you already mentioned, ways in which this IRA definition is being, is gaining a great deal of state support, both in Europe and the United States. And I'm curious why you think that is the case, given the kinds of cautions that you've both noted. Joyce, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Many may disagree, but I think the support for the IRA is not spontaneous. I think it needs to be seen in the context of a concerted efforts to challenge Palestinian rights through legal channels and limit Palestinians' rights to speak. And put forward their, our own narratives. And so I think there's an underlying, system to a lot that is built towards that. The push to have the IRA definition be accepted at a political level is part of an organized political campaign. The introduction of legislation at the national level, at the state level, as I just mentioned, is coordinated and pushed by advocacy groups with connections to the pro-Israel lobby and the Israeli government. I think that there are significant resources behind this effort, and the goal is to maintain the status quo and to stop criticism of Israeli policies and action. This move should be seen in the context of similar efforts, as I mentioned, that make support for BDS illegal. Again, legislation to restrict people's rights to engage in BDS actions have been introduced in nearly every state. And so I think it's a well-oiled machine. The over 24 state bills that were popping up in 2018 and 2019, like the case I just talked about, are, blatant examples of how dangerous tying criticism of Israel is to the nonviolent resistance and tying the criticism of Israel and nonviolent resistance to the hatred of Jews. So that effort that also links the wider lawfare process and seeks to criminalize my sister humanitarian support organizations as well, with lawsuits that have been filed against the Carter Center, the Norwegian People's Aid, World Vision, Oxfam, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and others. All of it is part of that same system. So this work runs counter to the work we do at AFSC, because as we aim to shift calls for justice and for justice and Palestinian voices to be really uplifted. So we condemn all anti-Semitism and work to root out all forms of it and all forms of discrimination. But the push to legalize the definition, the IHRA definition, isn't really about rooting anti-Semitism. The politicization of it, the legalization of it, is really to suppress and silence Palestinian voices and the voices of those who are working towards Palestinian rights. So that's how I feel about what is going on.
I have a little bit of a different perspective on it. I mean, some of the background to the formation of the definition, I talked about the Second Intifada, and it goes back further. So it's important to remember some of the history. Between 1975 and 1991, the UN declared Zionism a form of racism. There was overt discrimination against Jews in various places, including the UK. There were students who were told, because you were Jewish, you were Zionist, you're a racist, we can't have racist clubs. And then there was a World Conference Against Racism in 2001. There was an anti-Semitic orgy with, the protocols were there and Hitler didn't finish the job and that type of stuff too. So those types of things were fresh in 2004 when the definition was created again to take the temperature as a major thing. The EUMC was sort of ambiguous about what it was doing with the definition. The Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU, which became the next entity of what the EUMC had begun, was unclear what they removed it from the website. There was a push in 2016, but I think, from people like the Southern, the Simon Wiesenthal Center and others, but look at it from their point of view. I mean, I disagree, as you could tell, in terms of the implications of it. But from their point of view, they believe that anti-Zionism, as anti-Semitism, as a chant again, trying to revitalize it, was something they wanted to push against. So they wanted to push against anti-Zionism, which is why, again, you had Pompeo make his statement about anti-Zionism, Kushner. So it's not just because they want to suppress Palestinian speech. I think that's the effect of it. But from their point of view, they believe that anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism. As I said, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It's much more complex. But as we learned from the field of hate studies, we all try to make the world simple, especially when our identity is tethered to an issue of perceived social justice or injustice. So we want to know, is it on this side or is it on that side? They want to put it on that side. And there was a concerted effort to do it, also because it becomes relatively easy to say, this is how we want you, as France or other countries, this is how we want you to combat anti-Semitism. Mayors adopt this statement. That really doesn't say much about how you combat anti-Semitism. And that, to me, is the real shame of all of this, because I spent my career dealing with hatred and anti-Semitism. And the debate about the definition has become a black hole to suck away attention from what do you actually do about anti-Semitism. And the worst, most depressing moment for me when the executive order was signed was not that it was signed, but here you had a group of people that were praising President Trump. I think Dershowitz said something like, this is the greatest thing that happened to the Jewish people in, however how long. But we had Pittsburgh, and we had the shooting at the Tree of Life, and we had the shooting at the Tree of Life, because anti-Semitism, we all know, thrives best when leaders posit there's a them and an us, and we have to protect us from the them. Anti-Semitism is an explanation for what goes wrong in the world. And so Trump's vilification of immigrants, of Muslims, I think contributed to the environment in which we have seen an uptick. I mean, clearly it predates Trump and will continue, it's around for 2,000 years, but this exacerbated it. And Jewish leaders who should understand that dynamic was a real problem, to create an underbelly for anti-Semitism, to be violent. They went there, and the person who was the chief promoter of these us versus them, that's how you should look at the world, they said, what a great job you've done. So it's become a black hole to take us away from the discussions of things that we ought to be doing about anti-Semitism. And we could talk more about that if you want, what we should be doing on campus, what we should be doing in other places. But we're just talking about defining it as opposed to doing anything about it, which to me is a shame.
Yeah.
I want to kind of dig into a few of the things, Ken, that you said, and Joyce, that you said, because in a sense, it does seem that this meta conversation about the definition has a certain form of distraction in it. And I find, and I'll just speak personally, that it also makes it a little bit tricky to even know how to delve into the substance. So, for example, Joyce, you were talking about a kind of concerted effort that you perceive to really discredit any kind of criticism against the state of Israel, to allow for Israel to continue its policies in the territories and with regard to the Palestinian people. And Ken, you pointed to ways in which the line between saying that Zionism is, a vastly powerful effort to dominate the world, and that it is, full of a kind of form of hatred, that those efforts over time have had a kind of intersection with efforts to say the same about Jews, and that there are ways in which these two things have a kind of connection. So I'm curious if we can kind of move a little bit beyond just, is it a good definition or not? How are ways you think about dealing with that, right? I mean, what does it mean to be, on one hand, criticizing a sovereign state, and on the other hand, to know that there is a kind of well of history, an available vocabulary about global power, about forms of conspiratorial, domination that does get tapped into? How do you think about that messiness, that complexity? Does one of you want to start?
Joyce, you want, or I can, whatever you want.
Go ahead, Ken.
Okay, well, it is complex, and that's to me the critical word, because as I said before, we try to make everything somewhat simple, and anti-Zionism can at times feed into these anti-Semitic tropes. They can sometimes, you see things, the world will be better off without Jews, the world will be better off without Israel. Complaining about Israelis controlling the world versus Jews controlling the world, and we see things like that. But the recognition that it ties into it is really complex. I mean, some of the debates about, for example, look, you have a Jewish star in the middle of an Israeli flag. Well, is that, when somebody's protesting that, is because it's something Jewish or because it's something Israeli? And people on each side tend to try to have the worst motives of complaining about the other side. One of the things that I think is really essential in all of this, and I think that's one of the things that I think all the sponsors of this evening have underscored, is to have some empathy, to try to have some imagination. I mean, if I were, born in Joyce's situation, I would likely have a different view of this. And if she were born into, my family, I lost a lot of folks in the Holocaust. I have a connection to Israel, and I've seen anti-Semitism. I've been a victim of some anti-Semitism, couches anti-Zionism. You'd have a different perspective, but all that is true. One of the things, as you mentioned, that I have a book called the Conflict Over the Conflict. And one of the things that I love this sort of couplet in it. I have a letter that came, or email that came, from the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel to the Iroquois Confederacy, because the Iroquois were going to go to Israel to be part of the international lacrosse tournament, and that's a big deal. The Iroquois invented lacrosse. And the letter basically said, don't come, you're victims like us, we're settler colonialist, people come in and taken our land, taken our identity, dispossessed us, displaced us, we're brothers, don't come. I contrast that with Judea Pearl, who's Daniel Pearl's father, a UCLA professor, who said that anybody who says that Israel is a settler colonialist state, name me another place where people are coming to a place that they consider their birth, that they speak a language spoken there before the current inhabitants, who don't name places like New Warsaw, New Berlin, but the names in biblical times. And the reality is both of those things are true. And it's communal advocacy to pick one or the other. But it's important in this context to say that both are true and to really be cognizant of where bigotry comes into this, both in terms of denying Palestinians any humanity or their desire for self-determination, or conversely with Jews.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ken. I can't agree with you more about empathy. I was asked to bring my whole self into this, Lila, and to me, I full disclosure, of course, that I come with my biases. I come with my lived experiences, and so for Palestinians, I've been in the U.S. Sort of straight now over 8 years. And before that, I lived, the majority of my life in Palestine. And so for me, this is very personal. So I interact with a lot of people here, and I'm always on the, fringes. If I'm going to talk about my personal story, am I going to be accused of being an anti-Semite? And that hurts. So allow me to indulge just with this personal perspective, perhaps one that people on this call do not hear often. I'm not a refugee. I lived a privileged life in comparison to my Palestinian sisters and brothers, and I'm an American citizen at birth. My father was a U.S. veteran, although a Quaker conscientious objector. But I'm a Quaker. I'm a wife. I'm a mother of 3 grown men. The only Jews I ever encountered growing up in Ramallah were the soldiers who roamed the streets and shot my friends and intimidated me every day while walking to schools. The ones who bombarded my towns and shut down the water and electricity lines, or the ones who gave me or denied my family permission to travel. That's my childhood. And of course, that changed when I traveled and I experienced the dear friendships and humanity of so many Jews in my life. But this is what this, I'm going to go back to the definition because people are using it and abusing it. And they are using it because I feel that if I speak about the daily pain that I experienced growing up in Palestine under an apartheid system, I'm an anti-Semite. If I speak about the time the soldiers cocked their rifle in my back with the intention of shooting me and my friend as we were hiking in the woods near Ramallah, I am accused of anti-Semitism. And if I speak about my heartache, the heartache of my people, their dispossession and decades-long situation in exile in refugee camps and beyond, I am called an anti-Semite. And if I express my anger about how the state of Israel was created, how its birth under the false and painful pretext of this is a land without a people for a people without a land, and how ethnic cleansing took root with massacres, destroying villages and forcing over 7,000 of Palestinians to flee, if I reject Zionism as a form of nationalism and a political philosophy, then I'm also an anti-Semite. So if I tell my story of teaching my neighborhood kids in clandestine classrooms after the Israeli military closed down the schools and deemed them illegal, I'm also an anti-Semite. And if I tell my childhood and adult stories of the daily humiliation and how I witnessed indignity every single day and how my best friend was shot in high school as she was walking home from school. I'm also an anti-Semite. And so I can go on and on if I tell the story of when the soldiers knocked on the door in the middle of the night and snatched my husband for no reason, or the night terrors my 10-year-old son had during the incursions to my city and the continuous bombardments. And he would wake up with a sore throat, not knowing why he had a sore throat from all the intense screaming. If I express my fury about Israeli settler violence and they're uprooting our olive trees and harassing our children as they go to school, I'm an anti-Semite. And if I believe in resisting my occupier peacefully by calling on boycotts and divestments and sanctions, I am an anti-Semite. So I am, if I'm pained about not of being prevented to enter the city of my birth. I was born in Jerusalem. My mother grew up in the old city of Jerusalem. We can't even visit there. Everybody on this call today can visit Jerusalem, and I can't. And I can't. Even as an American citizen, I can't, because I hold a Palestinian passport as well. So if I speak about the checkpoints, the diversion of water to the swimming pools in Israeli settlements, the house demolished, the land confiscated every single day, the detention of our children in Israeli jails, the killing of our young men in cold blood. I mean, should I go on? Really? I'm not an anti-Semite. I love Jews. I am an anti-Israeli apartheid system. I'm an anti-settler colonial system. I am an anti-Zionist. I am an anti-bigotry and discrimination and xenophobia. I am not an anti-Semite. So thank you for indulging me, really. But I thought that, you know, that's what these definitions and whether it's legalizing them or politicizing them, weaponizing them, that's what it does to my voice. For I have the right to speak my truth without being dehumanized. And this is what we feel as Palestinians, that we are prevented, even by law, to share our story.
Thank you.
If I can, that was obviously, incredibly moving, and no one is denying that history. But I want to say to you, to you, Joyce, that I'm a proud Zionist. I believe in terms of Jewish right to self-determination, and I see the complexities in the competing narratives. And my perspective is that ultimately both sides have to lose. That with trying to get one side to have complete victory over the other is a prescription for disaster and perpetual conflict. That Jews, having gotten their state in 1948, are not going to all of a sudden say, okay, take it away. I mean, I know that people are talking about confederation, other things. I may be wrong about that, but I think ultimately, to me, the two-state solution provides the opportunity for Palestinians to control their own lives. Jews should not be occupiers. Nobody should be an occupier. But I believe in the right to Israel to exist, and I'm a Zionist. But that doesn't mean that I think you're an anti-Semite. I don't. When I teach about this, there's a friend of mine, Derek Penzlar, who's at Harvard, who's one of the people that's described and has been writing about the JDA. And I use a wonderful sort of what if essay that he wrote. So what if the Templars, which were a Protestant group that had some connection to the land of Israel, had been the group that had come back and reestablished their place there? Would the reaction to that have been the same as the reaction to Jews in Israel? Would have been more like to Rhodesia? I mean, it's an interesting mental exercise to see. So the challenge to me is that you have two competing, perhaps irreconcilable national identities, and that to me is the crux of the problem. rather than anything else. And that makes it, that's why it's so difficult. And one of the things, we were talking at the beginning about the campus, what a great issue to talk about the complexity. How do we talk about difficult things? How do people have different perspectives? How do you learn how somebody that may see this entirely different from you, or not necessarily evil, and you want to say they shouldn't talk and they shouldn't even raise questions, but how do you get into their brain?
Mhm.
How do you see things that way? Not necessarily to solve anything, but to really understand critical thinking and to understand, how the world works with difficult problems. And instead, we're trying to simplify it, label somebody either as an anti-Semite or not an anti-Semite, and then move on. And
Sure.
that doesn't do anybody
Yeah.
any good.
Yeah.
Well,
Ken, sorry, Layla, I just wanted to say, if I may, just one thing about hearing each other out. I remember when I was the head of the school in Ramallah, I assigned the Diary of Anne Frank to our students. And because I believe in exactly what you're saying, that narratives are important to understand. We need each other's stories. And I think that is what I'm finding in this country, that I am being silenced over and over again. And if we really want to get to that place of coexistence, which I believe in personally, and I believe in the right for the right of self-determination for both Jews and Palestinians, and I have no squirms with coexistence under a secular, perhaps democratic state. And there are so many different models, and we're not here to discuss that, but in the respect of the humanity of the other, the respect of the dignity of the other, the story, the history. There's no place for Holocaust deniers amongst us, and we have to be true. Like you said, the narratives are so, and the mindset are so different. The Israeli Jews that I've encountered, they have a narrative of persecution. It's a tremendous weight that they carry, a fear that they carry with them every day. And my people have a history and a narrative of dispossession that we carry with us every single day. And so how do we reconcile those? I believe we can.
So I want to make sure that we have time to look at some of the questions. But before we do that, listening to you two talk and listening to this interaction of, clearly, as you said, coming from different perspectives, and yet being able to model a kind of empathy. I want you to offer some wisdom. I operate in a university context, and I have students who are at an age of their development when they're really hungry for thinking about, what's the right way to move into this world, to be a productive citizen of this country and of the world. And I worry that so much of what is modeled for them is not productive, right? That it's, that there is the us, them, there are stark lines, all conflict becomes abuse or harm. And I want to hear from both of you who've given so much thought to what it means to understand your own narrative, and then what it means to sort of be out in the public sphere, trying to ultimately work toward more people having a more just world. What are ways that we should be modeling for our students how to talk about these tough kinds of issues? What kind of wisdom do you have that you can share? And then we'll turn to some of the questions. So if you have questions, audience, you can put them in the Q&A.
Well, I've taught at a college, and I've run a center at a college, and I'm very proud of BARD. It's not immune from some of the other forces in the world, but it tries to underscore that a college education is to teach students not to be warriors for this or that, but to be critical thinkers. And it's a place to be disturbed by ideas. You don't want to, the push for safe spaces. I mean, you can't hear this, and it comes on both sides. I mean, and on the Israel-Palestine thing, I have a lot in the book about You know, the anti-normalization, you can't sit down and have a conversation with somebody who's a Zionist on one hand, and the Hillel saying you can't bring in former IDF soldiers because they might say something critical about Israel. Both sides are trying to say, we don't want people to be disturbed. I think you want to disturb people. I think you want to, you're going to be disturbed by ideas for the rest of your life. What better place than a college to do that? And there are ways to do it through education. I mean, some of the things about the campus, you know, obviously there are other things, training, curriculum, and so forth. But there are some, you know, great models. And, you know, there's a one that I mentioned in the book, which I love. I don't know, Joyce, if you know Natasha Gill and Ahmed Khalidi, but I figured you might. But there's a great course that Natasha came up with that's a simulation of the Peel Commission, which is, for those who recall, is Brits sent Lord Peel in 1936 to talk to both the Arabs and the Jews because the Brits had the mandate and what the heck are we going to do here? And the course was half a simulation where the students had to adopt a character who participated in the Peel Commission. And I found out about this because there was a Pakistani Muslim woman who was involved with J Street who had taken this course, and she had to spend a number of weeks as David Ben-Gurion. And when I talked to her about it, she said, you think that was weird? I'm an Israeli classmate who was the Mufti, and there was a Jabotinsky figure on my side who was much more difficult to deal with. And the reality of that is you put the students in so they can imagine, as opposed to being warriors about this, what was it like? What do we learn from history? What are the lessons we can, and when I talked to Natasha about it, she, you know, clearly it wasn't to change somebody's point of view, it's to open up their horizons. And I love, she said that students came in thinking, aha, you know, we're going to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, how it should have been solved back in the 30s. And they come out of it and say, gee, now we know why it hasn't been solved so many decades later. That's what education is about. There are more opportunities like that we ought to mind. The problem when I was running a small foundation to get funding for teaching 20 people how to teach this course, is that the funders, on some of the Jewish funders I went to, you know, you could see their brains working. Why should I be spending half my money to teach the Palestinian narrative? And there were Palestinian folks that I'm going to be tainted by taking any money, you know, from something associated with any Zionist. So it was a victim of its own problem that it was trying to solve. But the more we could figure out how to do things like that through education, the better off we'll be.
Thanks, Ken. I think totally agree. I think that you reminded me of when I was running the school, we led the Model UN program. And my favorite parts is when our students were assigned the State of Israel. So they had to go and defend the State of Israel. And I love that because it's really put them in the State of Israel's shoes, and I think these interactions are amazing, and great educational opportunities. You know, I'm not too familiar with the U.S. campus life. All I know is what I read. And what I read is that divide. And what I read about is that there is this us and them. And what I hope to see is that universities don't fall into the trap and force students to let go of a particular interest because of these legalities. Again, I think we need boldness and we need courage. We need educators who believe in that interaction amongst students of different ideologies, that they should be able to come together, and that they should open the spaces for them to do that. And I agree, there are so many models and different ways of doing that. But what I found most effective, and I've had experiences, I remember I was at one point I was in West Jerusalem, there's this institute that asked me to represent the Palestinian point of view to American students. That was back in probably late 80s. They were coming in to as a study tour to this institute, and I came in to speak to them about the Palestinian perspective. And the only time I made a difference in their thinking is when I brought them to the other side, and they interacted and they broke bread with refugees, and they toured the cities, and I think that there has to be more of just dialogue. I think there needs to be more of a shared experience, and I think colleges and universities need to uh, you know resource and put a lot of thought into how to create these opportunities for really meaningful exchanges beyond rhetoric, but really experiencing each other.
And if I could add to that, just one thing, to get back to where we started the conversation, is the absolute worst thing you want to do is to have a university adopt a particular definition of
Yeah,
anti-Semitism that makes it impossible to have these discussions. I mean,
exactly.
there was the Minister of Education, or the equivalent in the UK, was saying that they wanted the different universities to adopt this and apply it. You had the Simon Wiesenthal Center that applauded when the definition was used to stop an Israel Apartheid Week event. Now, I'm not a great fan of Israel Apartheid Week, but it's expression. Students have a right to do that. And then they said, well, every university should follow the same model. So when you create these battle lines and say that it's totally illegitimate to even express these ideas, you really destroy the opportunities for the educational outcomes.
There's so many examples of that, from Harvard to San Francisco State, Florida, UC Berkeley, so many of these attempts. I agree.
And just one other point, because I just wanted to make sure for the audience too, that one of the things I chronicle in the book and other places is that this happens from both sides, not just the the pro-Israel side trying to stop. There's I find the idea of an academic boycott to be totally anathema. Scholars should be looked at based on their ideas, not whether they're connected to an Israeli institution. It's been overblown in terms of what some of the pro-Israel organizations have said, but the disrupting of pro-Israel speakers on campus should not happen, even though I think 16 were successfully disrupted between 2010 and 2019. So one is too many, it isn't ubiquitous, but each side is trying to stop the other side from speaking, and that makes it impossible to really use the educational environment to its maximum benefit.
So there are lots of questions, and there's no way we're going to get to all of them. And I just, first of all, want to encourage everybody who is listening to continue to have these conversations. Talk to the people around you if you're in classes, or you can subscribe to classes that deal with these topics. Please do so. So there's actually, I would say, almost a little bit of confusion perhaps, and Ken, I think you might be able to help us navigate this, about what exactly the IRA definition says when it comes to the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So some people seem to be indicating that it believes the two are synonymous, and others are saying that's really not quite what it says, and it's a more useful definition than we would think because it's not exactly saying that. So can you give us some clarity on that?
Yeah, and the short answer is both are right. But the fuller answer is, as I said, there were a bunch of different Israel examples because we thought it was important for the data points to collect them. Some things which I don't think are too content holding, all Jews collectively responsible for the actions of Israel and things like that. The two that are problematic and I think the most susceptible to misuse, one is about double standards about Israel. And the thinking process behind that was, you may recall when Israel was, in fights with Gaza, for example, there was some of the pushback was, oh, you shouldn't do anything. And if the United States was being bombarded by Canada or Mexico, nobody would expect that. So that was the thinking, but it's gotten, like any definition, it can be abused and stretched. And people stretch that to basically say, well, you have to, if you're going to be saying something about Israel, you have to talk about other human rights abuses elsewhere. And as I was protesting for Soviet Jews, I wasn't at the same time having to protest about Tibet, for example. So that was stretched. The one that's been used to say about anti-Zionism is denying Jews their right to self-determination. There's an e.g. Saying the creation of Israel is a racist endeavor, or words to that effect. So it doesn't say anti-Zionism per se, but people are using it that way. And people have used it, stretch it to say that it calls out, BDS per se, which, BDS was around. It may not have been, the term may not have been around, but the idea of divestment and so forth started in 2002. So it was not specifically listed there. But people, you put any definition, people are going to stretch it to try to use it to weaponize. So that's to me the problem. Not what the definitions this one, the other one says. It's that it becomes a target for people to use in political warfare.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Here's a question, I think, Joyce, that is addressed to you. Although it speaks to what both of you had said, and I'll just read it. Both speakers speak of hatred as being the barrier to dealing and hopefully eliminating anti-Semitism, anti-Arabic feelings, anti-Black feelings, etc. Seems to me that the boycott, divestiture, sanctions movement is a movement to deal with hatred through sanctions. Dealing with hatred through sanctions seems like the same issue Joyce has with Israel's relationship with Palestinians. So is hatred the best tool to use? Is it the best tool to use sanctions as a way to deal with a problem that, do you understand, there's a sense of a kind of circularity? So
Yeah.
So can you address?
Yeah, I mean, as a Palestinian, I don't see sanctions as hatred. I see it as a strategy to put pressure to attain my rights. We have seen it used time and time again in histories. Boycotts, sanctions are used to put pressure for change to happen. When and it is a nonviolent tactic, and it's effective. And so, if you are living under an apartheid system, a military rule, and you are looking for ways, decade after decade, day after day, to liberate yourself, you have to look for strategies and strategies that are effective. And so I don't see sanctions as hatred at all. I see them as effective tactics that have had a good track record in getting results. And so if everything fails, go that route, do the sanction. Why can't a bill was just released by Representative Betty McCollum. It's saying, that our tax dollars in the U.S. should not go to Israel to spend on the detention of Palestinian children or the annexation of land, etc. I mean, that's a sanction. If the U.S. says to Israel, you should not use any of our military aid that in a way that violates Palestinian rights, that's a sanction. I don't think that's hatred. I think that's the right way to go.
Okay. You want to add something,
Yeah,
Tim?
just I mean, I agree that it's not hatred. I'm no great fan of BDS. I think that it empowers, the extremes in many ways. But I see it as varied. I mean, I'm less concerned about somebody wanting to boycott Golan wines or something from the West Bank. And I understand if I were a Palestinian, I'd see this as a potential way to get attention and so forth. But I see again, the challenges with, as I've mentioned, the academic boycott. I don't think there's any and that really gets under my skin because it violates a basic premise of academic freedom. And that's one of the things that I think is really important when you're trying to protect the rights of students to have an Israel Apartheid Week, or trying to protect the ability of a professor to talk about their experiences and why they may have an anti-Zionist, view, or assign anti-Zionist, writers. Why you have to underscore the academic freedom is across the board. And you know, some of this is basically just about being a good teacher, and you know, as opposed to the you know, the details.
So a few more questions about campus life. So one asks or says first, of course, that campus life extends beyond the classroom, and open speech in class can lead to thinking that sometimes discriminates against Jews in other contexts, in other campus activism. Jews told, for example, and we know that there have been cases of this, that they can't participate in a particular activity or a group because first they need to disavow Zionism. The question asker says sometimes they've been asked to disavow Judaism. I don't know those cases, but perhaps that's the case. And then combining that with another question that's, you know, what does a student do when a professor seems to be espousing a point of view that seems really anathema to what their personal experience is, or what you know, they have really been raised to think is really important, whether it has to do with supporting Israel or supporting Palestinian rights. So how, you know, both thinking about the kinds of pressures that this puts on students, thinking about the ways that this can become weaponized, I suppose, right? You know, the word that we're using, you know, and thinking about whether all of those protections of speech and academic freedom, you know, do there need to be limits on it? You know, if a student has said they have to disavow Zionism in order to be part of a club, is that appropriate? Is that inappropriate? So all those kinds of complexities, if there's pieces of them you can address, that would be great.
Well, I'm happy to go first. When I teach, one of the things that I say to students is, you know, that I'm going to be honest about what my beliefs are. And the only way that you're going to for sure get a bad grade is if you parrot back to me what you think I think. You know, I want to hear what they think. I want to give them the opportunity and the space to disagree. They have to support it with evidence, but you want to create a culture in a classroom where that's the goal. And you know, that's just a question of good teaching. I have a problem with there have been some instances where some professors have said, well, I'm not going to support a student who's otherwise eligible to go study in Israel because it's against my beliefs. Well, excuse me, your job is as a teacher not to put in a code of what's okay and what's not okay. You should send a student to wherever the student, if you think it's appropriate, if the student's appropriate to go. So you don't prioritize your politics. You put the student first. The question about the discrimination on Zionism is really tough. I think that you know, I've experienced that. I mean, I wrote in the book about in the early '80s where you know, I was active in the National Lawyers Guild. Somebody was saying, well, I was talking about some of the anti-Semitism that I was seeing in some of the pro-Palestinian advocacy, that I was harming the Palestinian cause, and you know, I should basically go away. You know, that was okay. So I went away. But I didn't know that that was anti-Semitism per se. I thought that was just a strident, dogmatic us and them view of the world, which I found problematic. And I think that relates to some of the anti-Zionism. Is it possible that there's some anti-Semitism there too? Yeah, I mean, there was a case of Rose Rich, who was a student who was succeeded to become a role in student government, and she was vilified on a lot of different ways. I was not convinced that when she was up for nomination that somebody had asked her, because she was active in a pro-Israel organization, would she be fair? I thought that was a fair question. Someone said, as a Jew, would you be fair on a BDS motion? That's a different question. You're active in a just like saying if you're active in a Catholic group and something came up about reproductive rights, would you be able to be fair? You know, that's you know, a different ball game. But you know, the flip side of that too is I've seen Palestinian students also being told they can't participate, they shouldn't be able to participate in student government because they had experiences very similar to what Joyce had. And they were told because they said something and put something in a tweet when they were 12, they're, beyond the pale too. So I think, there needs to be some more forgiving for people, some more listening, some more understanding. And there's some support from the adults too to unpack this and not to further polarize, saying, yeah, that's good, that's bad.
Mm, mm. I'm not too familiar with these cases. I have not been following, but I think that groups also have a right to say who comes into their group. If it's a club of for LGBTQ and they don't want a homophobe to join them, I mean, come on. And so it's their right to say that this is group are for people who believe in so and so. I mean, I think that that's okay as long as they're respectful. And I think that, I don't know if what these cases looked like, but affinity groups, people who want to be in the same space should be also allowed to do so. I don't think it's discrimination. I think they have the right to form their own spaces that are safe for them.
Yeah, just some of these cases are a little bit more complex. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like that, okay, there's a coalition around, taking the news of the day, George Floyd, Black Lives
Right.
Matter, and so forth. We're not letting you in, the Hillel group because you're a Zionist. Well, that to me, is that anti-Semitism? Probably not, but is it
Right.
problematic? You'd hope that
Sure.
there were people that would help people look, past that. They may decide. See, part of the problem too, to me, and the reason why I don't jump to this as a conclusion that it's, automatically anti-Semitic, is that there's a problem on campuses against conservatives. There have been protests against, having Steve Bannon come to campus, and Ann Coulter and Milo and those folks. So the question is, on this, if you're a Zionist, is that being seen as a conservative position, or is that being singled out because it's Jewish? And sometimes you'll see some indication that it's the latter, but sometimes it may well be the former, and that's why it's a difficult thing to untangle sometimes.
Yeah.
So actually on that point, one of the questions, and maybe we have time for just this one and perhaps one more, is kind of pushing on that point of, if a student, or if, I think, Ken, you announced yourself as a Zionist, how does the positionality of that person, so if somebody says, I'm a Zionist and I am Jewish, does that leave the possibility for somebody else to say, I really abhor your Zionism, if you yourself has sort of presented these things as, and I'm not saying you have, but if one has presented these things, Jewishness and Zionism, as really interconnected. So I think it's, a few question askers really wanting to kind of get into the mechanics of that we might want to say in a neatly divided way. Okay, when we say X, Y, and Z, and it's about the sovereign state of Israel, and that's anti-Zionism, that is not anti-Semitism. But when we confuse a Jewish person for necessarily representing Zionism, that's anti-Semitism. There's a neatness to that, but there's a messiness of the kinds of realities of how people position their own identities and then the difficulty of that bifurcation. So can one or both of you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I think when you teach, you want to be honest. And again, you want to give students the opportunity to explore. So I make it clear, I've had Palestinian, so I've Muslim students, I've had students that have had, people in the IDF, and students, from a variety of different places. And the job as a teacher is to make them all feel comfortable being who they are and saying, what they think. And that to me is the core of it. The harder problem is that the question about relation to Israel and Zionism inside the Jewish community, and what that means, and who's inside the tent and who's outside. And that's, in some ways, that's the internal battle that's being had, and it has an impact on Palestinians, of course, but it's mostly an internal Jewish debate. And one of the founders of Open Hillel, who I quote in the book, said something that really stuck with me. She said she had, in Hillel, no problem, nor did any of her cohorts, sitting down and breaking bread with people who were Reform, conservative, Chabad, atheist, whatever. They could all sit down. Over Israel, it was such a divide that they couldn't actually get together. It's become such a contentious issue. And inside the Jewish community too, now look at some of the young people, and if not now, do I agree with them all? No, I mean, I probably, if I were, 40, 50 years younger, I probably would have been, down the same road that they are. But their Judaism informs them, their anti-Zionism. And even though I have a different perspective on my Judaism and my Zionism, who am I to say that they should be outside of the tent of their Judaism is any less authentic than mine? I don't want to define that. I don't know if it can be defined, but the problem, getting back to where we started again with the definition, is that people are effectively asking the government to make that decision of this internal Jewish question. And that troubles me more than anything else.
Lila, I hesitate to talk to, because I believe it is an internal sort of issue here, but I've always contemplated, how Israel managed to have a claim over Jewishness. And I think that to me is core. And, the Jewish people are pluralistic, multicultural. They span the world. They speak different languages, eat different foods, and so that conflation of being Jewish with Zionism is something I've always felt I could not understand. And some say that Zionism is a form of xenophobia as well. And so I struggle with that myself as an outsider to sort of the Jewish faith, but I've always contemplated that. Yeah, I need to understand it better.
Joyce, just a quick, I mean, we could have a longer conversation
Yeah,
some other
I
time.
know.
But to me, it's helpful to think of Jews as a people. I'm a card-carrying atheist, and I'm Jewish as my wife, who's a rabbi. And the connection to the land. That's why the competing narratives, temples face Jerusalem, languages. I mean, there are connections there that inform some of the Zionism. So to think of Judaism as just a religion, I think misses some of why this is such a complex thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And I do want to say that, so I am a Jewish historian, and in fact, exactly the questions that Joyce was asking, like, what does it mean to think of a territorially nationalistic movement as being the kind of proper fate or place of the Jewish people? In fact, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were so many debates about that issue, right? And there were non-territorialists, and there were non-Zionists and anti-Zionists and Bundists and this and that. Like, so this is just to say that it's not a self-evident answer, and yet also to be able to hold what Ken said, that the question, what is the relationship? That's been a long-standing question, right? So it's not a new thing to ask about this, and to feel like there is a way in which conversations about Jewishness are at least oriented around this kind of question about land and about place. So we're coming up against the end of our time together, and I want to make sure I give each of you the opportunity to just say whatever you'd like to say in closing, and maybe invite you just to spend a minute reflecting on this kind of conversation, right? And ways in which you think we might be able to move forward, what in my mind anyway, you really modeled as a productive dialogue with clear points of disagreement and also ways of talking to one another. So any kind of closing thoughts or words, and then we'll call it an evening.
Joyce, you want to go first, or?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed this, and so thanks for including me. And Ken, I've been following the Bard College and Al-Quds University collaboration for the last decade, and my former students have gone through that program. And so, I think that that's just a lovely interaction there. But this is what really matters. This conversation, and the more of it is what really matters. Really digging into the other's narrative, and that's and I just want to say that says it all to me. Once we start understanding the other, where the other's coming from, the narrative, I think that's where the change really happens. And to me, I've seen my Israeli friends change, and I have changed as a result of my interaction with them. And so we just need more of that. We need to bring our shared humanity together, and because that's what it boils down to. We had COVID. It's really underpinned that we are so connected as people, and I think we just need to keep that front and center, and grab opportunities to sit down with the other and to really dig in and understand each other deeply. And then way will open. I know in Quakers we say there's a light in every person, and so I believe in that light, and I think that we have to always seek it in each other and in ourselves. And so the more we speak and the more we interact with each other, the more we get there. And students, you're at the center of it. Grab your opportunities. Don't shy away from talking to someone because they have an opposing point of view. It's all about that change process and that transformation that's continuous within.
And I would echo all that and just say, the reason why I run a Center for the Study of Hate is that I want people to have the capacity to think in a multidimensional level and to understand again why we're so susceptible. This issue, policing, immigration, blue state, red state, why we're so susceptible. Our minds were developed over millennia ago about how to see the person over the hill, and that might be a danger. It informs how we think. It informs how we view our identities. It informs so much of who we are in the human condition. And we're getting more and more pushes to go inside our bucket and beat up on the other side, whether it's, you watch Fox News versus MSNBC or all these other ways. And to students, what I'm saying is try to break that down. Don't get it's seductive. It's addictive. It's, Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist, who I quote, talks about morality, both blinding people and binding them together. When you feel that, they're absolutely evil, I'm going to try to stop them from speaking. I'm going to define them as hateful. Stop and think about what you're actually doing. And again, have that emotional empathy and imagination to think about, would I feel the same if I were in a different circumstance? And to look at yourself and to always reevaluate, how do I know what I know? Is it right? Should I change my mind? Who else should I speak to? Seek out people that have a different point of view than you do. That to me is a question of scholarship and just a question of being, civically prideful, is to understand different points of view as best you can. What else is life for?
I want to thank you both for bringing your wisdom, to bringing your whole selves and your stories, to bringing your perspectives. And, I also really want to thank our partners in this program, Congregation Rodeph Shalom and Stockton University. And of course, I'm from Temple University, from the Feinstein Center. And I want to say that, this has certainly convinced me that we need to have more of these kinds of opportunities, and not just on the screen, but also when we can be face to face as well. So I know that all of the partners are invested in continuing to have opportunities where people can hear one another's perspectives. They can work through that hard work of figuring out, where do I stand and why do I stand that way? And how do I recognize the other and see that common humanity. So I want to thank you both for just your wonderful, wonderful participation in this program, and say good night to everybody. And hopefully we will see one another in person in the days to come.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you all.
Good night.
Good night. Take care.
Night.